Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome to this week's live chat. I'm super excited to spend a couple minutes with you talking about different questions that you might have. It's a Ask Me Anything type of live chat. If you're watching live right now, you can type your questions into the chat. Jessica, as always, is behind the camera, writing them down as quickly as possible so I can talk about them. But I also get on about 30 minutes before the live chat starts, and I've written down a lot of the questions that have come through. So great questions. I'm excited to talk through it. A couple things, first of all, I have some special helpers here in the live chat. I've got my two nephews. You may have seen each one of them separate on previous live chats. Come on, guys. This is Truman and Ellett, but now they're both here together. Oh, so they're helping me out during the summer and folding fabric and stuff. So say hi, everybody.
Hi.
All right, now go back over there to Jessica. They're gonna run the questions over for me. So pretty fun. I love those little guys. Love keeping it in the family. Before we get to the questions, couple things. Congratulations to Julie Hoffman. She's the winner from last week's live chat. So email us, Julie, and we'll get that to you. I also commented on your comment. And this week I've released a few videos. So if you're a subscriber to my YouTube channel, you already got a notification about that. If you're not, go ahead and subscribe. First one was a new midnight quilter. I showed the newsprint quilt. Showed you how to make a fun column quilt with strips, nice and quick. So that was cool. And I also released a couple of just quilting videos. And those are things I'll be kind of putting out a little bit more often. That's just where you can watch the design develop. I know in a tutorial when I'm talking, I'm kind of breaking it up and talking through the steps, but sometimes it's good for me just to close my mouth and you can watch it come together. Again, those are all on my YouTube channel, so if you're not a subscriber, be sure to subscribe or go find it, and we'll have all the details there. All right, but let's talk questions. I know when it comes to Freemotion quilting, there are so many facets and things to talk about, and I'm so excited to share my opinion and expertise. But just remember, it's just that. It's only my opinion. So if I say something that contradicts how you're already doing it, don't change it based on that. So some questions that came through from Melissa and Linda, they went right off the bat. How do I move a big quilt around when Freemotion quilting on a sewing machine? How do I keep it from falling off the sides? Now, quilting on a sewing machine where we're moving the fabric and not the machine, or like I like to call it, the smush and push, can be a little tricky for bigger quilts. The name of the game here is to keep gravity away from us. So we want to keep that whole quilt up, either on the table, up next to the machine. We want to throw it over our shoulder. We want to wad it in a ball. Something that does help me when I'm filming, especially, is I'll put some quilt clips on it just to kind of keep it rolled up and out of the way. When you're quilting, you can only really focus on a part about this big, so get that spot under your needle and get the rest up and get it out of the way. But there were some amazing suggestions on the type chat when that came through. For instance, Leah said that when she quilted on a domestic, she got a thick foam core board, cut a hole in the shape of the machine, and then placed it on the table under the quilt to kind of like a big Supreme slider. And other people were like, yeah, I've used dry erase boards. Whether you have to get some folding tables, you need to get some chairs. You just want to keep that fabric up because you're going to be fighting that gravity, and you don't want to do that. And there's some other questions I'll talk about, proper, posture when doing that. But really, you just have to reposition often and keep it up, off similar height to your needle. It's that drag that makes it difficult. And I'll be filming, and I'm like, this is so difficult. And I'll pause and look, well, no wonder the quilt has fallen off the side of the table and now gravity is pulling it. So it's like a tug of war when I'm trying to quilt. That's just no fun. Not easy, not fun at all. So hopefully that helps. Just know that when in the videos, I edit that part out just because you don't want to watch me shuffle that fabric around. So there's a lot of that repositioning as you go. So there you go. Susie asked a great question. I haven't been asked this one before. Why are a lot of quilts designed square instead of rectangular? So why are a lot of quilt patterns written for square quilts? Well, I can't speak for other designers, but I will say that one of the easiest ways to design a quilt is on a grid. And if you have squares, that's usually going to end up, square blocks is going to usually end up in a square quilt. So that's one of the struggles I have with our block of the month, because I know that quilters want rectangular quilts for their bed. So I try to use the borders to make it more rectangular. So hopefully that helps. It's just easier to design it that way, but it can obviously be designed any way. So some great questions about patterns. We'll see that one again here in a second. Another question about batting. Okay, so what loft of 80-20 do I use? So when I'm quilting on my sewing machine, I love to use the fusible batting because that's how I make my quilt sandwich. And the Quilter's Dream, which is the brand, the fusible batting, only comes in one loft. And so that's the loft I use on the 80-20. When I talk about loft, that's just talking about the thickness of your batting. And the more loft your batting has, the more definition you'll have to your quilting. The more puffy it'll look, the more it will, be more like a comforter-like type style. But the higher loft means it gets a little tricky sometimes. So you just gotta kind of decide what you like and what your preferences are when it comes to the loft of your batting. And then there was another question right about batting right after that. So the batting that I use on my long arm is a poly batting, and it is the Select Loft. So Quilter's Dream has 3 different lofts for their poly. I can't remember, Deluxe, Request, Select. I picked Select because it was in the middle. That's all I did. All those years ago when I started long arming, I was like, I'm just gonna go with the middle and call it good, and I've just stuck with it. So again, the loft that you pick is just a personal preference. But when I'm quilting on my long arm for like Tula Pink, her quilts, I'll put 2 layers of that Quilter's Dream Poly Select batting because it makes it thicker and it gives that more definition. Well, the question was, why 2 layers of Poly Select instead of a batting with thicker loft? Right? That makes sense, right? If I want that thickness for that definition, why wouldn't I just use a puffier batting? Well, there is one main reason and one side reason. The main reason is when I started quilting for customers, I only had room in my quilting room, in my quilting studio, for 1 roll of batting. Those batting rolls are huge. So I did Poly Select, and when I did Tulas, I would just put 2 of those together. So it was more of a necessity thing, which I'm gonna pause and say that's why you have to be careful when you follow what other people say, because you're like, oh, she uses 2 layers of Quilter's Dream Poly Select. Well, that was just out of necessity. That might not be the situation for you. But I will say the side reason, we have tried, mixing up using like a wool or something with puff. For her specifically, especially these quilts that are gonna be displayed and hung and kind of, hung on a wall or hung on a frame or a display, it just helps it hang flatter and straighter. So even the loft, like you think wool or puff, will have that definition, but it might not hang nice and flat. Again, that's just kind of where we landed and where we just stuck. I'm noticing, or I'm realizing, the more I talk about my quilting styles and preferences, the more I'm like an old dog with new tricks. So there's that deep, deep reason why I use 2 layers for hers. Kathy had a question about quilt patterns. This is a really good one too, like actually making your quilt top. How do you turn a quilt pattern into a wall hanging? A lot of the times the pattern will tell you how to make it bigger. How do you turn it into a wall hanging? And this is gonna be different for every person and every pattern, but the general suggestion I would give, look at your pattern and break it down into its individual components. So if we were to look at that newsprint quilt, if you want to turn this into a wall hanging, I wouldn't shrink everything down. I mean, you could. I would pick maybe out the block and maybe make 4 of them and make that into a wall hanging. The pattern is already there, the instructions are already in there how to make the block, so you could use that as you wish. That's kind of the easy answer. If you try adjusting the sizes of your pattern, just remember the 1/4 inch seam allowance does not shrink or increase. So if you're like going from 4.5 inches to half size, you're not gonna go to 2 1/4. You're gonna go 2 inches plus your half. So it'd be 2.5, which again, is crazy that I even know so much quilt math. Math was not my strong suit in school, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. So hopefully that helps. All right, Susie had another question. How much practice does it take to learn how to quilt a machine quilting design in different directions? She's asking for a friend, not for herself, of course. When I talk about learning new designs, especially when you're on a long arm, you have to learn how to do it in all different directions, left to right, down to, up to down, vice versa. And I always say, practice in one direction and get the hang of it first. Learn the design and then try to turn the corners. I will say it doesn't take as long, I don't think, to learn how to quilt the design in different directions as it does to learn the original design. You already know the path, you just gotta get comfortable doing it the other direction. But everybody, not everybody, I'm generalizing, most quilters have a natural side that feels more, comfortable. Like, for instance, going up and down was not difficult for me, but going right to left took a second to wrap my mind around. So it doesn't take as long as you might think. If you can do it one direction, be glad you're like 75% of the way there and know that the rest will come with practice. And when I was learning how to quilt, let's say I'm working with the ribbon candy, which I can do left to right. Maybe I would just freehand it left to right, but on the verticals, go ahead and mark it out. just so I could have that guideline. Everybody is different, and so I wish I had a set. It takes 4.7 days, but it just depends on the design and how you're working through it. All right, my friend Amy from Ecuador asked, what's the best way to piece or applique on a long arm? This is a fun technique where you load your backing and your batting, and I'm gonna kind of try to talk through it without pictures, which makes it tricky. But think of quilt as you go. Piecing on a long arm is basically quilt as you go, where you're gonna lay your fabric right side up, push another piece on top of it, right side down, and you're gonna stitch along that and flip. And you can actually even iron right on your long arm if you're careful. So look for patterns that are quilt as you go. Strip quilts are a lot of fun to do. Applique is great as well. If you already have your piece top, you can applique around it. I want to say I have a video of the layered challenge where I did some stuff with that, but I can't remember off the top of my head. One thing that does help though with the long arming, if you have the Handy Quilter long arm, the square echo feet really help with that piecing on there. So I know that's a quick answer, Amy, and I'm sorry I can't give you more detail, but look for quilt as you go patterns for that. Along the long arm vein, somebody else asked, do I find long arming easier than quilting on a sewing machine? So in those just quilting videos that I just released this week, I've just done long arm, but I'm gonna do some on the sewing machine as well. It looks so effortless as I quilt, and that really is one of the benefits of a long arm. It moves so fluidly. It is difficult when you're learning to control that, to know how to handle that ease of movement. So I do find long arming easier than a sewing machine. But I need to preface or kind of say, this is because I learned on a long arm first. I went from hand quilting to quilting on a long arm, and then learned how to quilt on a sewing machine so that I could teach. And it was a little bit of a transition going the other direction. Some quilters like to have their hands on the fabric, they like to be able to sit, they like to be able to hang on to it, and they might find it a lot easier than that freedom of movement that comes with a long arm. So really, I really think the reason I find long arm quilting easier is because that's how I learned. And then also the reason I don't quilt with a regulator, stitch regulator, is because I learned without one. So really a lot of that plays into how it works. It doesn't mean that I can't quilt on a sewing machine or that you can't quilt on a sewing machine. It just means that we're gonna approach everything a little differently. I feel that most people don't use the equipment they have to its full capability. So while I do find it quicker and easier, there are things that you can do on a sewing machine that you can't do in a long arm, like start in the center, or work in a spiral, or change the orientation of your quilt so that you don't have to learn your designs in all different directions. So hopefully that helps. Dee asked a great question. What's my favorite glide thread color? I was like, oh geez, that's like asking my favorite child. I don't have a favorite color. I go through phases. So I was thinking through this question. I'm like, there's the thread color I use the most. Yellow Whisper is probably the one I use the most. But my favorite ones are the fun ones I don't get to use as often. So I went and pulled a couple of my favorite colors right now. Cantaloupe, I'm so in love with this color. It's like it's not neon, it's not bright, it's just pretty. I mean, it's bright, it's not neon. It's orange, but it's not screaming orange, it's just really pretty. It reminds me of orange sherbet, and it looks really good on gray fabric or darker fabric. And then pink lemonade. So I like cantaloupe and pink lemonade, just that fun pop of color. But it really just depends on the quilt I'm working with. I love all the thread colors, and I love picking out thread colors, and so it was hard to pick just a couple. So hopefully that helps. This is a great question from Kathy. When you're quilting on a sewing machine, how tall should your table be? How tall should your chairs be for your perfect posture? And this is so important. So all of my sewing machine quilters out there, listen up. I don't want to quilt like a T-Rex. I don't want my hands up here. I want to be able to push down. So I want my elbows above my hands a little bit, right? So if my hands are above my elbows, I'm too low. The reason is I'm kind of fighting gravity here. If I can get up a little higher where I'm pushing down, I'm using gravity on my side. Now, you don't want to be so high, so tall that you can't see what you're doing. So adjust your seat to find that perfect spot. When I teach quilting classes in person, especially if I'm traveling to other areas, I'll tell quilters, put a pillow on your chair. I mean, because when you're in a class, it's not your setup at home. Put a pillow on your chair, put two chairs together. You want to get up a little bit. So when you're quilting, check that out. Make sure you're able to push down and you're not T-Rexing it. Another thing that's really going to help with your posture is those bad habits. And I get it. When we're learning something new, we want to hang on tighter and we want to look closer and we want to hold our breath. That's actually not going to help. So keep your back straight, move your arms, and have that good posture, and it will help you quilt longer, because we all have, that desire to quilt as long as we can. Hopefully that helps. Again, if you don't have an adjustable table or adjustable chair, you can sit on pillows, sit on quilts, and I've been in classes where I'm like, sit on some quilts of mine to get you to that proper height to help you out. So hopefully that helps. All right, Tammy, great question. She needs some tips for using the pounce pad to keep the chalk from coming off. So I was gonna see if I have one real quick. I should have checked it. A pounce pad is basically like what it sounds like, a pad, and I pounce it on a stencil and it puts chalk out nice and quick. The problem is it does come off pretty easily. I love that because it's easy to come off. I don't have to put water on it. One thing that I do to help with this is I don't use my pounce pad until I'm ready to quilt. So that means if I need these guidelines, I wait till I'm at that block, I mark it out, and then quilt it. That means it won't come off as I'm shifting the quilt around, especially on a sewing machine. If we're rolling the quilt and shifting it around, that chalk's gonna come off pretty easily. So if that's the case, I'll use the ultimate marking pencil, which is like a solid pounce pad, solid chalk pencil. But some suggestions came through the type chat before we went through. Somebody said they put cheap hairspray, just lightly sprayed on there to hold it in place. I thought that was interesting. I've not tried that. And someone else said they use a paintbrush to kind of apply it where they want it. But just know that if you need something more permanent, like, or not permanent, something that's not gonna just brush off, I would use like a water-soluble marker or that ultimate marking tool. Hopefully that helps. Okay, Nona asked, do I use pantographs? Personally, do I use pantographs when quilting? I did in the beginning. Pantographs are where you quilt from the back of the long arm and you kind of have your pattern laid out and you're kind of tracing it with a laser light. It's great for very specific patterns, right? So patterns that I want a volleyball with a dog print, like I want this shape that's not easy to free motion because you can just trace along those lines. It's also great for learning how to long arm because you kind of have that path to follow. I did a couple in the beginning, but not any since then. To me, I struggled with lining up the rows, and when you're working on quilts, I want to be able to see the quilt top and make sure I'm, moving around where I need to, even if I'm doing just an all-over swirl. So there are definite benefits. I just don't use it, and that's just how it works out. All right, got 2 more questions, and then I'll need the questions from my helpers. Judy, also, sorry to go back to the quilting big quilts on a little machine. Judy had a great point. She uses pool noodles as bumpers around her table to keep the quilt in. I thought that was great. Buy a pool noodle, cut it to size, cut it in half, and then cut one side and slide it on there. Thought that was genius, Judy. Genius in your head. All right, Jennifer asked, do I personally change the quilting I'm using depending on the use of the quilt? For instance, if it's gonna go on a wall, if it's going to go to one of my nephews, will I quilt it differently? Yeah, because the intended use of the quilt plays a big role in how I'm gonna quilt it. If I'm quilting a quilt for Tula, I'm going to, highlight the fabric and highlight the pattern and really kind of have fun with that. If it's a wall hanging that doesn't need to be cuddly, I'm gonna quilt that sucker to death. If it's for my nephews, I'm gonna quilt Aunt Angela is your favorite aunt. I mean, so yeah, that definitely does play a role in the designs I pick. Doesn't mean you have to, that's just how I do it. So, all right, we have more questions. Those were just all the ones that came through the type chat. So Truman has some. Thank you, sir.
Yep.
So helpful. And then Ellett has some. Thank you. Jessica, you're hand tired. She's been writing them all down. I've been quilting with my feed dog still up. It's been helpful, but am I supposed to? Will it hurt my machine? I can't speak authoritatively on the inner workings of a sewing machine, but I don't think it will hurt it at all. So, like, if my feed dogs are up and I cover them with my Supreme slider, they're basically negated and I can just quilt without them. Honestly, I usually, almost all the time, leave my feed dogs up because I'll forget to raise them back up when I take that Supreme slider off and go quilt. So I'm sure there's somebody out there that maybe is more mechanically inclined that might be like, I don't think that's the right way, but it's not ever affected my machine. So I don't know. That's how I do it. How do I like the disc cutting mat? So the Martelli board is amazing. And so you see that a lot in my videos because it rotates and it has the pieces that come off and on, right? So if I'm cutting, I can put that cutting part on. I don't have it here, so I'm just kind of like making the arm movements. Now, it is pricey, but you're getting a cutting mat, an ironing board, and the rotating base all together. So save that as like a Christmas suggestion or a Mother's Day suggestion. I love it. I love it, love it. It's not great for quilting big pieces of fabric, so if I'm cutting out like the fabric for my quilt, I'll use my regular mat. But trimming half square triangles, game changer, because you can just rotate it. Anything that you have to piece and trim in between, perfect, and it's small enough that it just sits right here. So I'm not affiliated with Martelli, but I do love their products. So hopefully that helps. All right, so question about sewing machine posture and height. Let's talk about the long arm. How high should the long arm be to prevent strain on my neck? And this is, again, kind of like the sewing machine. I don't want it so low that I have to bend over to see what I'm doing. This is incredibly important on a long arm because as we're standing, if we get into that hunched mode, we can really hurt our back or our legs or our feet. So I want it high enough that my hands are above my elbows or even, and I want it high enough that I can see what I'm doing, but not so high that I can't see what I'm doing. My long arm at home is pretty high. It actually comes up kind of to my sternum or to my ribs because I'm horrible about wanting to bend over, and that will keep me from doing it. Most long arms are pretty easy to raise or lower, and I will say, as a general rule, I feel like most quilters have it too low. So you want it a little bit higher, that way you don't bend over. But regardless of how high or low your machine is, you don't want to bend, you want to stand up and then use your hands. So I won't keep harping on that, but you know, we want to quilt all day, we don't want to get hurt. So what's the easiest quilting design to learn for a very beginner Freemotion quilter? If there was one right answer I could tell you and you would be wowed with my knowledge and skill. The easiest design to start with as a Freemotion quilter is a design that you might already doodle or know how it goes together. You're like, that's weird, right? So weird. If you draw leaves, you've always just doodled leaves, that's gonna be a great one to start with. Something that looks familiar to you. Every quilter is different. My job would be a lot easier if we were all the same, but we're all different. For instance, the meander, which is the very basic kind of curvy stitch, I struggled with that. I skipped right past it. I never really liked it because I couldn't get that down. It's easy in the fact that it's not made up of a lot of steps, but the actual application of it is a totally different thing. If you've always kind of drew little swirl shapes, you might find that easier. So it really just depends what you want to quilt and what you kind of already have the eye for. So if you want to pin me down on a design, I would say a loopy kind of design, a loopy meander, because most of us have handwritten E's and O's and we're already familiar with that shape and then just kind of refining it. In our quilt shop, I can have a new person come in that's never quilted and have them quilting their name within seconds because they already know the path. I won't harp on this point, but I'm going to just say, you know, most of quilting is knowing where you're going. Learning how to machine quilt and machine quilt a new design is like learning how to drive a car and navigate a new city at the same time. It's tricky. So using anything we can to make that, you know, navigation a little bit easier. I hope that helps. Okay, this is a great question. I've not been asked this. How would I handle a quilt that is bigger than my long arm frame? The short, easy answer is that you can't. That is one of the limitations of the long arm frame. It can't be wider than the frame itself, in theory. It can be long as you want because you're rolling it up on rollers. And I'm fortunate enough to have a 12-foot frame, and I've not quilted anything bigger than that 144 inches. I've not done this, but there are workarounds, and you can do some things where you only pin half of it and you fold the bulk over and roll it up. I don't know, I've not ever done it. So that is one of the things about quilting on a long arm. If you have a smaller frame, you're gonna have to get creative with that. I have not done it, so I can't speak to that. The difference here is if you have a little foot frame or a long arm frame that looks like a hoop, a big hoop, like Handy Quilter has one, that one can do one of any size, but not the regular ones. All right, can a low shank ruler be used on a high shank sewing machine? Great question. So a low shank ruler is thinner for those machines that don't have a high enough shank to get under that set screw that holds the foot on. In theory, yes, you could use a low shank ruler on a high shank machine, but be careful that whatever it is, that foot isn't above the ruler, because I don't want that ruler to slide under the foot. So if you have a dynamic foot or a long arm, not usually, but for the most part, I think in theory, yes, you could do that. How do I keep from getting quilting too dense when quilting on a sewing machine? Well, I love to quilt things to death, and I don't know that I've ever seen anything too dense for me. Really, the consistency in the density is going to come with practice. So if you're working on a design, you're like, ooh, I want everything to be about this big. Keeping a visual reference next to you, a drawing or a quilted sample next to you will kind of help you gauge that. But no, with practice, you'll get more comfortable with keeping that spacing consistent. I think that's the question that's being asked here. Loved my quilting on the long arm, so helpful. Are there any more in the works? Yes. So the just quilting kind of stuff, we'll see more of those. I have so much footage of me quilting that gets chopped down into smaller bits that it's just fun to see it all come together. A side story, not that you really need to know all this, but when I'm putting together videos for YouTube, I try to keep them, especially tutorials, nice and within 10 minutes. I don't want them to drag on and on. I know you want to hear me talk forever, but not everybody does, right? Just keep it snappy and quick, because I'm very easily distracted and I get bored very easily. So, but I know that some of us want to see that come together, so I'm going to start pulling out some of that video footage I have and kind of reworking it so that you can see it go together. So yes, you'll see more of those on a sewing machine and long arm. Can I Freemotion or use a ruler to quilt a Baptist fan? I'm sure it's possible. I don't plan on finding out. I struggle with designs that are very obvious when they're not right. Right? A swirl, can you say a swirl is wrong? Not really. I mean, as long as I do it all the time, it's fine. But Baptist fans, cross hatching, anything that's going to be pretty obvious, if it's off a little bit, I steer clear from. I know there's some quilters that have, and there's some fun, like wonky modern Baptist fans, but I just steer clear of it personally. But I'm sure somebody could, and I would love to see a picture of that. Will there be a new Freemotion challenge quilting along coming soon? Yes. So we're looking at tentatively, fingers crossed, August, end of August, beginning of September. So can't wait to share that with you. It'll be fun. And then will I be sharing the new Tula quilt? Yeah, I gotta wait till she posts it and then steal some of her pictures. I was so behind on that quilt that I never even took a single photo of it, so I'm hoping I can grab some from her. But yeah, it's fun quilting for her quilts because it keeps me sharp and keeps me kind of going, so I love it. Great questions. All right, I hope you all have enjoyed the Ask Me Anything. I know if you're watching live, you might still be asking questions. Sorry, I can't get to them all. Or if you're watching this later, you might be like, oh, I had that great question I want to ask. Well, you can find our Freemotion Challenge Quilting Along Facebook group, or you can leave them on the comments of the videos. I get on there from time to time and answer them. But also other quilters are so giving with their knowledge and information that I'm sure other people will chime in there and help out. So you can get your questions answered one way or the other. Now, before I let you go, a quick announcement. This is actually the last live chat until August 24th. So I'm taking off the next couple of months. We just got back from a college visit. My middle daughter's going off to college. I'm gonna be a wreck. I've gotta help get her ready for that. Then we're planning a big family trip. So I'm thinking I'm gonna take a little bit of a sabbatical after such a busy season, but I will be back August 24th with both my girls in school, my son hopefully successful and healthy and happy and me ready to focus on quilting and back to our weekly live chats and the live challenges. Now that doesn't mean that you're not gonna see me. I'll be releasing videos or I'll be posting stuff, just the scheduled live chats. We're gonna put it on break just until August 24th and we'll come back and that will probably, hopefully be the announcement for the next challenge. So I hope in the meantime, everybody stays cool. If you're in the hot area, it is freaking hot out there, and hope everybody stays safe and have a great, great rest of your summer. Until then, everybody, happy quilting, and I'll see you soon.